welcome to Games as Lit 101. Today's topic has already gotten plenty of coverage, but recent events have quite well shown the necessity for that, and it is particularly important to our analysis of Shadow of the Colossus next week. Let's talk about the damsel in distress. Given the aforementioned recent events, I imagine most of my viewers probably already know what this trope is, but just in case, I'm gonna go over it really quick before we talk about why it's important, why it's a problem, and why it sometimes might not be. Now, this is the last time I'll mention this, I promise, but I know that anything regarding women in video games is kind of a hot topic right now. Now, my intention here is not to stir things up, alright? Because Lord knows we have enough of that already. My goal here is simply to examine a trope that definitely does exist in a medium that definitely does use it a lot. This is cultural and artistic examination, so let's go into it as such. The damsel in distress trope is as old as time, and it's telling of the values of patriarchal chivalry that governed many civilizations in the past. It consists of a woman being held captive and unable to escape, until a man comes along and rescues her. It's often the main conflict of the story, but can also simply be a scenario within a larger tale. Now, if this scenario sounds familiar, that's because of course it does. If anything is more overused in video games than saving the world from terrorists, aliens, or monsters, it's this. Mario, Legend of Zelda, Double Dragon, and literally hundreds of other classic games used this plot formula, and it's still being very commonly used today. Heck, most of the franchises that used it back then are still using it with nearly every single entry in the series. The fact that this trope exists and is widely used is irrefutable. The discussion surrounding it then is not about its use, but rather about whether or not it's a problem. The answer to that is, of course, not quite so simple as a yes or a no. Some things are kind of justifiably inherently offensive. I mean, if we're supposed to be rooting for a rapist in a story, or maybe the story is founded on some really racist principles, or we're supposed to enjoy the mass murder of innocent, helpless people, yeah, that's kind of a good reason to get offended by that. The damsel in distress trope is not one of these things. There's nothing inherently offensive about the idea that a particular woman cannot protect herself. What's offensive is the idea that women as a whole cannot do so. And while saving one princess in one video game probably won't give that impression, saving women again and 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 again in video games kind of does. So ultimately, the trope is problematic on two levels, creatively and sociologically. The creative problem is, again, not necessarily anything wrong with the trope itself. It's just that it's so common that it's become a cliche. We groan whenever we see it, just the same way that we groan when the young hero's village is burned down, or the couple has some sort of trivial conflict but gets back together at the end, or amnesia. That doesn't make it offensive or anything, just lazy and uninteresting. The bigger problem is the societal one. Playing a game about saving a princess is not going to suddenly make us sexist. Even playing a lot of games about saving a lot of princesses isn't necessarily going to do that. But art is a powerful thing, and it's difficult to overcome ingrained stereotypes and attitudes when so much of the art we consume perpetrates them. Well, I genuinely wish I could say that we as a society view women as equal to men, not just legally, but culturally, psychologically, and just generally seeing them as being worth the same as a man. We don't. If we did, we wouldn't see the level of harassment and victim blaming and stereotyping that we do. Which means we still have a ways to go before we can overcome some pretty deeply ingrained stereotypes regarding women. And while no one is claiming that video games about saving helpless damsels are causing this problem, it would still be really nice if video games could help solve the problem instead of just being part of it. It all comes down to this. When a story centers on a man saving a helpless woman, it's a story about how a particular character could not defend herself and needed rescuing by a man. And that's fine. But when half the stories in this medium are about a helpless woman who needs rescuing from a man, it writes a larger cultural narrative suggesting that women, in general, are weak and need saving by men. And that's not so fun. But to be clear, I am not saying this trope should never ever be used, nor am I saying that we should start overusing the reverse scenario. No one actually is saying that. We enjoy seeing this trope averted or reversed because it's such a common narrative crutch, but the goal here is to improve the representation of women in this medium, not to start representing men poorly instead. In fact, used properly, this trope can be completely fine. Being helpless is a perfectly legitimate character attribute and can, of course, lead to positive growth in the character. It just has to actually lead to positive growth on the part of the affected character, as opposed to just using their distress for the purpose of furthering the male hero's story arc. Or at least in some way, the woman should have some level of significance to the story beyond just being a goal the hero is working toward. Basically, if you could replace the woman in the game with a magical artifact or some other important object of some kind and still have the basic story intact, something's wrong. But there are plenty of good examples. The first while of Star Wars includes our male heroes saving Princess Leia, but not only is she established before and after this as a legitimately important character to the plot and the expanded story, she actually helps fight her way out right alongside them. Basically every character from Avatar: The Last Airbender, male or female, is in need of rescue at one point or another throughout the series, but they're all competent and well-developed characters who depend on each other equally. In fact, the only character who never genuinely wants help from others is not exactly a good role model. And while you may protect Yorda and Aiko, she's also absolutely vital to your success, and the game builds a simple but beautiful relationship between her and Aiko. Ultimately, no work exists in a vacuum. There's nothing wrong with this trope on its own, but its overuse has become something of a larger cultural problem. Like anything else in a story, if it's there, it should be there for good reason, not just as a motivation for the hero, but as a legitimate character and story element in its own right. So go ahead and hit the comments with your, well, comments. Let's keep things civil and discuss what is, for better or worse, one of the most overused tropes in this medium. The subscribe button's down there, the Patreon link is a little further down in the description, and, well, you know what to do with those. Now, it's time to analyze one of the true masterpieces of this medium. A game so utterly unique, beautiful, and impacting that we're still talking about it and desperately clamoring for another entry in its mythos to this day. Join us next week as we wander through the land of beauty, tragedy, and symbolism that is Shadow of the Colossus. So until then, class dismissed.